The morning she walked into the store, a ghost in a worn dress, everyone fell silent. Her two small children clung to her skirt, their eyes wide and hungry. She placed a single tarnished coin on the counter. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. "I need to buy a beam for my cabin. I have 50 cents. The shopkeeper stared at the coin. Then he burst into laughter. The men playing cards in the corner joined in, their chuckles filling the dusty air. One of them muttered it wasn't even enough for a handful of nails, that what she carried was just charity disguised as pride. The woman's face burned with shame. She tried to explain. She told them she would pay the rest with work, that she only needed one piece of wood to raise a fallen wall, so her children wouldn't have to sleep under the rain anymore. But the shopkeeper just pushed the coin back at her. His face was a mask of disdain. "Poor widows are better off begging at the church," he sneered. A heavy, cruel silence filled the room. It was broken by the sound of firm boots approaching from the back of the store. A huge man emerged from the shadows. He had a dark beard and shoulders shaped by years of hauling logs in solitude. He took the coin with his rough, calloused fingers and held it up to the light. "50 cents are enough," he said. His voice was a deep rumble, like distant thunder. "If I pay the rest with my name." The murmurs stopped. Every eye in the room followed his hand as he laid it first on the coin and then on the widow's shoulder, as if sealing a sacred pact. Without another word, he walked over to the stack of lumber. He lifted the heaviest beam in the store, hoisting it onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He forced his way through the stunned onlookers and out the door. The woman, tears burning in her eyes, hugged her children and followed him. She clutched the coin in her palm. It no longer felt like a symbol of mockery. It felt like a symbol of dignity. Outside, beneath the relentless sun, the mountain man stopped. "A cabin is raised with hands, not with coins," he said, not looking at her. "Show me where yours is." She nodded, her voice breaking. As they walked toward the path that led into the valley, the whispers of the town followed them like a river of disbelief. Some said it was madness, others said it was mercy. But they all knew they had just witnessed an act that could not be bought with gold or with 100 beams. The path to the valley was overgrown with weeds. It was a path no one had walked in years. The woman, Ilara, walked ahead, her two small children clinging to her skirt. The mountain man followed, the heavy beam resting on his shoulder. His steady steps echoed like a drum, announcing that something new was about to begin. When they reached the cabin, what they saw was a skeleton of wood, crooked walls, a sunken roof, stones fallen from the chimney. It looked more like a grave than a home. Ilara lowered her gaze in shame. She murmured that this was where she'd spent her last days of marriage before the sickness took her husband. After his death, the house just seemed to give up, yielding to the wind as if the world itself wanted to erase them. The man, Kyle, dropped the beam to the ground without a word. He knelt beside the foundations, pressing the soil with his hands like a doctor examining a wound. Then he rose, drew an axe from his belt, and began clearing away the debris. Sharp, clean blows echoed through the quiet valley. The children, frightened at first, crept closer to watch him work. The youngest one asked, his voice full of innocent wonder, if he could really fix a house so broken. Cale paused. He looked at them with weary but steady eyes. "Everything can be mended," he said, "if you start with the heart." He pointed to the coin Ilara still clenched in her hand. "That is more than iron. It is a promise." She was surprised to hear him speak so much. A strange warmth spread through her, a warmth that didn't come from the sun, but from the way his words seemed to stitch together the cracks in her soul. They spent the afternoon gathering timber, straining to lift the fallen structure. As the sun began to sink, Cale placed the new beam as if it were the cornerstone of a church, fastening it with ropes and his own immense weight. Ilara, breathless from exhaustion, offered him a bowl of water. He drank, then bowed his head in thanks. No words were spoken, but in that silent gesture there was more gratitude than in 1,000 phrases. That night they lit a small fire in front of the half-raised cabin. The children fell asleep in each other's arms. Ilara watched the firelight illuminate the scars of solitude on Kyle's face. For the first time in a long, long time, she was not afraid of the coming day. The house was still broken, but something new was being raised along with its walls. The days that followed were filled with the sound of hammers, the creak of logs, and the laughter of children. Kyle raised the walls with the strength of his arms. The children gathered stones for the chimney, placing wildflowers in the cracks as if they were crowns. Ilara, who had never known how to use tools, learned to hold nails while Kale guided her hand with the hammer. He showed her patiently how to set the wood, how to secure the angles. At first, they barely spoke, but soon they began to share stories. She told him of her father, who used to say 50 cents was enough to start anything, as long as you had faith. He, after long silences, confessed that war and winter had taken his own family, and that he had learned to speak more with the trees than with men. Each word was another stone set in an invisible wall of trust, growing stronger with each passing day. At dusk, after the children were asleep, he would draw his knife and carve small wooden figures, a horse, a bird, a moon. He would hand them to her without a word, and she knew they were gifts more precious than any coin. One rainy night, water began to drip through the half-finished roof. Without thinking, Ilara grabbed a bucket and climbed onto a chair to stop the leak. Kyle, surprised, smiled faintly. "You are no longer a widow who waits," he murmured. "You are a woman who builds." She blushed. His words were stronger than any praise she had ever received. The 50-cent coin remained wrapped in a small cloth by the hearth. Each time they looked at it, it seemed to represent more than just metal. It was a reminder of shame transformed into dignity. With every day, the house ceased to be a ruin. It began to breathe. It began to feel like a home. But the town was watching and whispering. The whispers from town arrived like a cold wind. While Ilara and Kyle raised the walls in quiet partnership, the neighbors gathered in the tavern. It was improper, they said, for a widow to be alone in the valley with a stranger. It was indecent. A 50-cent coin could not cover such shame. The women said she was a bad example. The men laughed, assuring each other the cabin would soon become a den of sin. When Ilara heard the rumors at the town well, a knot tightened in her chest. The cabin walls were rising strong, but her reputation was being torn down, stone by stone. She returned to the valley and found Kale splitting logs. "Should I leave?" she asked, her voice low, "before the gossip destroys my children?" Kale froze, his axe in midair. He looked at her with his dark, steady eyes. "The wind speaks," he said, "but it does not topple a trunk that is rooted." He took the coin from its cloth and pressed it back into her palm. "This was your payment," he said, "but it was also your courage. Never give it back." That night, as rain battered the newly nailed boards, his words were like fresh beams, carrying the weight that threatened to break her. But the real storm was yet to come. At dawn, when they went to the market for nails, her late husband's brother, Silas, intercepted them. He raised his voice so the whole street could hear. "That cabin is not yours," he shouted. "The land is bound by family debt. Neither a stranger nor a copper coin can grant you rights." A crowd gathered, laughter mixed with accusations. The widow trembled. But Kyle stepped forward. He raised the coin high for all to see. "She paid," he declared, his voice firm. "I finished the price with my name, and no one can erase what is already written." The confrontation was far from over. Silas was not a man to be denied. He gathered half the town in front of the church. He clutched a roll of papers, proclaiming he had proof. proof that the land and the cabin belonged to him by blood inheritance. A widow cannot raise walls without her family's consent, he shouted, shaking the documents like a whip. Everything built will be mine by dawn. Her children are nothing more than intruders on sacred ground. The people murmured, divided. Some applauded him. Others kept silent, uneasy at the cruelty in his words. Elara's heart pounded in her chest. All they had built together could crumble in an instant. But then Cale stepped forward. He snatched the papers from Silas's hands and held them high for all to see. And with a slow, deliberate gesture, he cast them into the flame of a nearby torch. He let the fire devour every single letter. "No paper holds more value than the life already built here," he said, his voice like thunder. "She paid with the little she had, and I gave what remained of me. My name, that does not burn." The crowd erupted. Some called him a barbarian. Others cheered his courage. Silas, enraged, swore he would return with the sheriff. He swore the cabin would be torn down with axes. Elara trembled, but Kyle took her hand in front of everyone. He lifted it, revealing the bright coin in her palm. A reverent silence fell. The elders murmured that they had never seen a man seal a pact so strange and so powerful. A small coin turned into an unbreakable promise. That night, as the valley lay restless, Elara understood. The battle was no longer just for a house. It was for her right to exist with dignity. The clatter of hooves announced the sheriff's arrival. He dismounted before the cabin, flanked by 2 armed men, an iron hammer hanging from his belt. He carried a demolition order. The widow had until sunset to vacate, or the house would be reduced to planks. Elara felt the world collapse. She clutched the coin in her fist, as if that small piece of copper could hold back the full force of the law. But Cale stepped forward. "A paper is signed at a table," he told the sheriff, his voice calm. "But life is signed in the earth. There are children who sleep beneath this roof. I will not let them be robbed of the only thing they have." The sheriff sneered. "Defend her, and you'll face jail." Then Cale did something that silenced the entire valley. He drew his knife and drove it deep into the new door frame. "My name is here," he said. "My life pays what is missing." Elara, holding back tears, placed the coin beside the knife, joining the 2 symbols before everyone. The sheriff hesitated. He had come to enforce an order, not to spill blood over a 50-cent promise. The crowd that had followed him pressed in. Some demanded the law be enforced. Others begged for mercy. Then Elara raised her voice. "50 cents was all I had," she cried. "But with it I bought dignity, and he paid the rest with the one thing that cannot be stolen, his name." The sheriff pressed his lips together. He slid the papers back into his jacket and muttered that he would return with reinforcements. He left, but his threat hung in the air like an unsettled storm. This was no longer a dispute. It was a war, and the first battle had just been won. Dusk had barely stained the mountains red when Silas returned. He brought 6 men armed with axes and ropes, their voices rolling with jeers. "No woman defies the blood of family," one of them shouted. Elara, seeing them advance, felt her heart stall, but she did not flee. She took the 50-cent coin and held it up before her children. "This brought us here," she said, "and this will keep us." Kyle, who had been chopping wood, let his axe fall. He planted himself in the doorway, his arms crossed, his shadow thrown long by the firelight. "If you want to pass," he said, his voice a low growl, "you'll have to cross my name first." The men surged forward. Silas raised the first axe, but before he could strike, a light appeared in the darkness. Then another. A small group of villagers had arrived, carrying lit candles like torches of judgment. An old man spoke, his voice cracked but firm. "I have seen too many injustices. A woman who pays with the little she has deserves a roof, not chains." The murmur spread. Some of Silas's men began to falter, watching the lights tremble in the dark. Silas roared with rage, but no one wanted to be the first to challenge the mountain giant, or the candles that seemed to multiply by the minute. Ilara stepped forward. She placed the coin in the door's lintel and raised her voice. "With this, I bought my home. With this, I bought my life. If you want to take it, you'll have to tear it out with blood." Silence fell like a stone. Silas, his face twisted with frustration, threw his axe to the ground. He swore he would return with the sheriff and the law at his back, but when he left, he went alone. His men had finally understood. Force does not always prevail when courage shines in the dark. 2 days later, the sheriff returned with a larger group and a new document. He had official backing to evict and demolish the cabin. Ilara, her children clinging to her, stepped onto the threshold. She placed the 50-cent coin on the main beam, visible to all, like a sacred seal. Kyle stood beside her. "She paid what she could," he said, his voice carrying across the valley. "And I gave my name. This house was raised with dignity, and dignity does not fall." The sheriff, irritated, ordered his men to advance. But then an unexpected murmur rose from behind them. Dozens of townspeople had arrived. They carried candles. They carried freshly baked bread. They carried buckets of water. They set these simple symbols of life before the door, creating a barricade of light and hope. An elderly woman spoke. "I have seen women dragged into the dust. This will not be another. A coin may not buy wood, but it can buy respect." The armed men hesitated. They had come to execute a paper, not to face a united town. One of them lowered his axe. He would not strike a wall where children slept. The sheriff, red with rage, tried to impose his authority, but his every word was answered by the unbroken silence of the burning candles. The weight of the crowd forced him to retreat. Ilara, tears running down her face, lifted the coin high. "This is not copper," she declared. "It is life, and with it I bought a home for my children." The town, which days before had mocked her, burst into slow, steady applause. It swelled until it thundered against the hills, forcing the sheriff to turn his horse and depart, defeated. That night, as the candles still burned, Ilara knew she was no longer alone. The town had seen in her 50 cents something stronger than any law written on paper. But the fight was not over. Hatred, once defeated, often returns in the dark. The night was silent when Silas returned. He was alone, maddened by his defeat, a burning torch in his hand. He was determined to reduce the cabin to ashes rather than accept that he no longer held power over it. Inside, Ilara slept beside her children. Cale kept watch from the window. He had sensed the threat had not yet ended. When he saw the flickering light among the trees, he stepped onto the threshold, his knife in his hand. He stood firm, waiting. He knew this final battle would not be fought with blows, but with truth. Silas raised the torch. "The family's shame must be erased with fire," he shouted. "Neither a coin nor a name can cleanse the disgrace of a woman who defies blood." The words woke Ilara. She emerged, the coin in her palm, and held it against the torchlight. It shone like a tiny star. "This gave me a roof," she said, her voice broken but steady. "If you want to burn it, you will also have to burn the only memory of your brother." Silas faltered. In her words lay the wound of his own lost blood. Kyle spoke calmly. "You do not defend honor. You defend empty pride. Your brother lives in his children, not in your papers." The townspeople, alerted by the glow, began to descend into the valley, their candles forming a circle of light around the scene. Surrounded, scorned, Silas gripped the torch with trembling hands, but he could not bring himself to cast it. The flame died in the night's damp air, leaving only smoke and silence. Broken, he dropped the torch and fled into the darkness. Ilara, tears streaming down her cheeks, placed the coin on the threshold. Kyle laid his hand over hers, sealing their promise. Dawn came with a clear sky. The cabin, which had survived hatred, stood as a witness to resilience. Ilara stepped out with her children. She held the 50-cent coin between her fingers, raising it to the sun as if offering the entire story of her struggle. Kyle walked forward, took the coin, and nailed it with a single strike into the main beam above the door, so that anyone who entered would see it first. "Here is our price," he said, his voice low but clear. "Here is our promise." The children clapped. The townspeople gathered once more, kept a reverent silence. They understood this was not just construction, but consecration. An old woman murmured she had never seen a house raised with so little, and yet so precious. The men who had once mocked them now bowed their heads in respect. Elara looked at Cale. She realized the roof was no longer just a shelter. It was the bond that held them. She stepped closer, took his rough hand, and said in a voice the whole town could hear, "I paid with the little I had, and you gave what you were. That is enough to call it family." Kyle managed a small, hard-won smile. "Then there is no debt," he replied, "because we are already the same." The crowd erupted in applause as the children ran around their new home. Smoke from the chimney rose straight into the sky, a sign that life would go on. That afternoon, Elara carved their initials into the door frame. The town understood that something had been born there, something no law and no fire could ever erase. The coin, fastened high above, shone like a star, reminding all that even the smallest thing can sustain a universe when it is paid with love. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories. If you had been there watching that 50-cent coin nailed above the door, would you have agreed that it was already a true home?